everyone who wants to hear me? Great. If you don't want to hear me, please daydream. I wanted to start by locating myself. Actually, I wanted to start by not doing what everyone else did, which is to thank Brian. So I just want to say I'm glad you moved to LA, Brian. I wanted to locate myself. I have lived in one neighborhood ever, only in Los Angeles. I've been in Los Angeles for almost 13 years. I live in Cypress Park in Northeast LA. Last night in my bed in Cypress Park, I dreamt that Nicolás Guillen, the great Cuban writer, and Aimé Césaire, the amazing writer from Martinique, were giving a reading together, and I was going there with my collaborator. I also wanted to start by responding to something that was talked about a little bit on the first panel, and that is the idea of Los Angeles as a place of the transitory, a place of the between, a place of the migratory, and that somehow it doesn't feel like home to some people, maybe because of that stuff or maybe for other reasons. I wanted to say that it does feel like home to me because of those things. To me, I am an Angelina. I am a transplant here. I moved here from Mexico City, and I grew up in the Bay Area. But for me, being here as a transplant is to be home. In thinking about place and displacement and invoking the incredible lineage that Sesshu just invoked, I also wanted to mention Sun and Moon Press, which hasn't been mentioned today. I would not be the writer and thinker I am without that press, which was edited by Douglas Messerly, now at Screen Integer. And growing up, I started reading Sun and Moon Press books when I was 17. I had no idea they were produced in Los Angeles, none. I guess I didn't read Front Matter at that point, I do now. But it's interesting to me to think about Los Angeles and placelessness as somehow going hand in hand, but then also these very important cultural moments coming out of it. So now I'm going to begin for real. And I just realized that I need my timekeeper. Sorry, can't do this without my robot because I don't want to take too much time. Okay. I'm going to start by reading a poem. I'm going to read you the latest draft. This is a poem about a city that is not Los Angeles by a writer from Montevideo named Virginia Lucas. I am translating this poem. In fact, I did already translate it, and I'm going to read you the original and the translation. It is called Primera Lección. Trazamos el mapa de la ciudad a la que pertenecíamos, conocíamos el nombre del arroyo, el puente que unía a la capital, supimos que estaban la comisaria, las dos escuelas y el liceo. Entre dudas, alguien pronunció una sigla, UTU. No supimos dónde ubicarlas. De las fábricas solo queda el frigorífico y el aroma de la res volcado en el nombre del arroyo. Para llegar a nuestras casas mantuvimos en el ejercicio previo de armar el mapa las señas de siempre sin nombres. Allí, cruzando el pasaje a la izquierda del almacén de Rosa, ahí donde están los caballos, enfrente al arroyo, al lado de lo del gordo. En la colonia fue igual. Las calles están por hacerse, las numeraciones siguen hablando de la imposibilidad de referir aquí. El barrio que empieza hace 80 años todavía no es una ciudad. El cementerio, por suerte, no sabemos dónde ponerlo. Algunos vivos estamos. Nota a pie. Repita. Fuera del marco está la colonia Nicolich, paraje comprendido entre las rutas 8 y 101 al norte de la ruta interbalnearia. Lesson 1. We drew a map of the city where we belonged. We were familiar with the name of the arroyo, the bridge leading to the capital. We knew the police station was there, the 2 elementary schools, and the high school. Amidst doubts, someone mentioned an acronym, UTU. UTU, Universidad del Trabajo de Uruguay, Uruguay Workers University. We didn't know where to locate them. Of the factories, only the meat processing plant is left, and the dizzying scent of the cattle in the name of the arroyo. To be able to get home, we held on, in the prior exercise of assembling the map to the same old indications without names. There, crossing the alleyway to the left of Rosa's Market, there where the horses are, across from the arroyo next to the Gordo's place. In colonial times, it was just the same. The streets were about to be built. The numbers continue to speak to the impossibility of reference. Here, the barrio that began 80 years ago still is not a city. The cemetery, as luck would have it, we don't know where to place it. Some of us living still are. Footnote. Repeat. Outside the frame appears Colonia Nikolic, a spot on the road between bus lines 8 and 101, to the north of the Ruta Interbalnearia, the inter-resort road. So I wanted to start by reading a translation, partly because that's a very important part of my practice, translating, but also because I want to think about, and I do spend my life and my poetics thinking about multilingualism as the poetry of Los Angeles and as the real source of the vibrancy in this city. So I wanted to talk briefly about a part of my practice that might not sound like traditional poetry. That's on purpose. I don't have that much of an interest in traditional poetry, or I do in some instances depending on how you define tradition. But I wanted to talk about language justice as related to language experimentation. So I'm part of this collaborative called Antena with John Fluker, who lives in Houston, which is another of the great border cities like Los Angeles. I consider the Los Angeles metropolitan area an area of multiple borders. And one of the practices that Antena does is language justice. That is, in the most basic sense, the idea that everyone has a right to speak in the language in which they feel most comfortable in a space so that they can participate fully in whatever space that is. And so that there are certain concepts and ideas that branch out from language justice, and then there are certain tools that we use in order to achieve a multilingual space that actually functions well. So one of the things that Antena does is to help people organize spaces, usually community organizations, sometimes conferences, sometimes government entities or educational entities, whoever it is, organize multilingual spaces that will function well so that everyone in that space can participate as fully as possible. Earlier this year, I work as an interpreter both in the social justice context and in the non-social justice context known as the Los Angeles Superior Court System. And I have been looking for collaborators to work with here on language justice organizing. So earlier this year, I finally found some other social justice interpreters who are interested in doing that work. So we have formed Antena Los Angeles, which is the Los Angeles satellite of Antena. Those two interpreters are Miguel Morales Cruz and Ana Paula Nogues Mercado. So we've been doing a lot of work locally. In terms of the larger project of Antena, of language justice and language experimentation, what interests us most are the moments of difficulty and snag, where language starts to break down or falter, and where those are the moments of possibility, and those are the moments where learning and excitement can take place. So in a room, when two people don't speak the same language and maybe don't use the same terminology, but have a need to hear what each other can say and sort of come to some moment of shared ideas, that's the place in the room that's most interesting to us. Or in a poem, when two or more things are put in proximity and friction happens and it's not easy to decipher what's going on in that poem, those are the moments in literature that are most exciting to us. Or when you're trying to transfer really complicated thinking from one language to another, and it makes you slow down, as Andrew was talking about, and it makes you have to write and rewrite and rewrite over and over again. Those are the moments that feel like the moments of most possibility to Antena. So that's where Antena locates our work. And later on, if you want to know more about Antena's practice, I can talk about it more later. One of the other questions that we're asking is what poetry has to say, what a poetic approach to language might have to say to practices of organizing and political activism, and what organizing and political practices might have to say to our uses of language. So how can those too often opposed, so supposedly opposed worlds, how can they actually become porous and usefully speak to one another? In terms of thinking about the politics of literary space, and a kind of, a little bit of what I was hearing Andrew Maxwell talking about in terms of DIY autonomous practice as part of literary practice, I have this resource list that I share with my students, and I made 20 copies of it in case anybody is interested in it here. So maybe I'll just give it to you and take one and pass it if you want it, and if you don't want it, don't bother. And if there aren't enough to go around, I'll give you my email later, and I can email it to you. I also emailed it to Brian.
You could just leave it on the table there too, right?
Or we could put them on the table, but this way people who want them can take them and they don't have to be shy about coming up to the table. So I just wanted to go through a couple of these spaces. I'm not going to read you the whole resource list, but I wanted to do this as a way of mentioning some of the people who are most important to my practice, and also many of the people here, and particularly the people in this quote-unquote lane are really central to the way that I practice writing in this city, so I'm really happy to be in this room right now. The Los Angeles online literary calendar called LALitscene.com, which is co-curated by Harold Abramowitz and Janice Lee, totally kicks ass. If you want to know what's going on literarily in LA, that's where to go. I am very excited by the reading, there's many more things on this list, but the reading series at Avenue 50 Studio, which is curated by Jessica Ceballos, by Brooklyn and Boyle Artistic and Literary Salon, curated by Abel Salas, by Downtown Lab at Writ Large Press, curated by Jessica Ceballos, Chiwan Choi, and Peter Woods, The Empty Globe, curated by Amina Kane, General Projects, curated by Matthew Timmons, and then lots of other stuff that appears on the list. While we are listing and invoking, I wanted to mention 13 LA poets. So if I was going to choose 12 poets to be on panels up here, here are some of the 13 I would choose, in addition to probably choosing many who are here. Gloria Alvarez, Brent Armendinger, Neela Banerjee, Chiwan Choi, Andrew Choate, Luis Hernandez, Juan Felipe Herrera, Douglas Kearney, Janice Lee, who writes mainly prose but in a way that moves like poetry, Robin Costa-Lewis, Fred Moten, Claudia Rankin, and Amar Rava. I would also include Slangwidge, which is an art collective that moves like poetry, and the LAPD, not the cops, the Los Angeles Poverty Department, which works around performance poetry and visual arts on Skid Row. That said, I am going to talk about my poetics by enacting some of my poetics, and hopefully the machine will do as I say. Thank you, UCLA, for having functional systems. For a year, the year I turned 40, I wrote a cut-up poem out of the front page news of the newspaper in the place where I woke up on that day. I went to a lot of places that year, but I live in LA, so a lot of those poems are from Los Angeles. Not wanting to be too perfectly round, I couldn't manage to keep it to just a year, so like Harryette, there are 366 of those poems. It's a year and a day. Some of them are collected in this chapbook called Front Page News, published by Little Red Leaves Textile Series out of Houston, and there's some Antenna Publications, a translation, a collaboration, and then this chapbook up there if anybody wants to paw through them and or purchase them. So I'm going to read you a few pages from Front Page News. These are not poems about Los Angeles. They're poems made from the language of deployment of information that takes place in Los Angeles mass media. Los Angeles, Wednesday, April 20th, 2011. Ecosystem. Truck frames, tires, a burned out tank, plastic flowers lunged, perpendicular to the heart, firing, shooting again and again, building a city with bullets, corner, fire, bullets, wincing, broken concrete and metal, otherwise silent, tense, road, storefronts, furniture, the intersection of traffic. Los Angeles, Thursday, April 21st, 2011. Blast. Besieged city. Indiscriminate forces, killed, explosion, believe. Starkly dissimilar, flames, horror, caught fire, away. Oil field, thousands of acres blackened, the plague, the fire, part of a complex of more than a dozen fires and large fire complexes, blazes, or miles, fierce winds. Los Angeles, Friday, April 22nd, 2011. Deploy. State control, launch, city is city produced. Mired allegations, mismanagement, misaction, launched, money, months, city, state, and federal, city, city. Despite interior civil obedience, to end another day. Powerful, solid web of hope, of capital, with far abandon, large forces. Los Angeles, Saturday, April 23rd, 2011. Shadow. The people. Indiscriminate forces loyal to the protesters, the provocative, the divide, determine power and fear protest. Tens and hundreds of thousands poured into the names of dead, stability, borders, strategic forces, firing volleys, bullets, tear gas, weapons, spite. Los Angeles, Sunday, April 24th, 2011. Home. In the contaminated zone, houses, air, one warm spring, food, water, tears, prisoners, hostages. Power as force, locked access. Overseas and other nations have nothing. In radioactive breath, we eat, we drink, trying, remembered, buried, don't think. The years were a casket. Los Angeles, Monday, April 25th, 2011. Predators. Snatched, tortured and raped, killed and burned. Genocide is the killing state, or the brutal slayings and no one to stop it. Enough. War of force. Predators, current and future, blasting haunts, assaults nations against workers, graves, brush covered, the miles that border corpses. I'm going to skip some because I have something to say. Los Angeles, Saturday, April 30th, 2011. Security. Cloud of debris and sky. Or a deadly person, heart, concrete, fortified. Hangar-like structure, iconic graph paper, a looming nation, outside their fleeting, scribbled actions, poised against forces, advancing on the advisor, urging war or airstrikes or pressure. A brawny sun would understand. So in thinking about multilingualism and the multi-everythingness of our city and how to navigate that as one person with all of the possible knowledges and also lacks of knowledge that any one person has, I think a lot about listening and working as a teacher and an interpreter and a translator. My entire life is centered around listening. And I think of poetry as a kind of channeling of things that I listen to, of sometimes otherworldly things, sometimes things very much of this world. Part of what I was trying to do with the newspaper is listen to the news in a different way. I mean, I was cutting right with scissors and using, as you can see, Scotch tape to paste, so I wasn't physically listening, but I was listening in a tactile way with my hands through handicraft, and listening in a poetic way to the kind of language that surges up from underneath the surface of the language that is organized to encourage us to think in a certain way. And I feel like one of the things that poetry can do that's really revolutionizing is help us or spur us or spark us to listen in a different way, so that we, and also give us the language tools to imagine the world in a different way. And if it's not clear to you that the world needs to be reimagined and remade, then you are not paying attention. I assume that is clear to everyone in this room. So I'm really interested in thinking about different ways of listening and then how to reflect that, whether that's by translating work that's not from here and bringing that work into the literary conversations that happen here, whether that's making tiny homemade books and teaching my students to make tiny homemade books to be able to insert ourselves into the literary culture and participate in literary conversations without needing to ask permission from some authority figure to enter those spaces, or whether that's working as an interpreter, so using the privileges that I have as a white-looking woman, an educated person, and a person who has a facility with language, using those privileges to make space for other people to have a conversation or for other people to speak rather than me being the speaker. So I'm interested also in my poems. Obviously in my poems to some extent I'm the speaker or the arranger, but I'm really interested in thinking about how to not foreground the self and how to foreground the materials. And I feel like this city is particularly useful for thinking about other things to foreground besides self. So I wanted to end with one piece. Oh, I even have time to do that, that's good. Okay, I wanted to end, I never do this. I never, ever in life have excerpted a live film narration piece, but I am going to do that for you because these pieces are long, and I don't have a long time, but I wanted to talk about this practice partly because it is so LA. The movies, that is, are so LA. So live film narration, which I can talk about more in the Q&A if you're curious, but it's a practice where a writer or other performer collages pieces from usually an iconic film, mutes the sound, and then re-narrates back into the space of the film. The film that you're about to see, you may likely recognize it. It's called Chinatown. It was a little Roman Polanski piece from 1974, starring Faye Dunaway and Jack Nicholson. And the issues that I'm thinking through in this piece was written earlier this year, are very LA. So I'm thinking about drought and water, as you will hear. Normally, this is a piece spoken in three voices: the voice of the desert, the voice of infrastructure, and the voice of water. But I am just going to read it as one human. And I'm reading you two pieces, two small excerpts from this piece. And I hope the sound will work. To parcel, to parch, to thirst, swept sandscape, an open question, gapped, gaped, cratered, embodied scopescape, unswept, gagged with debris, to thrum, thirst, thread, to line, to turn, to dust, dusted, thirsted.
Do you know the expression, let sleeping dogs lie?
What's the value of oil? What's the value of water? If you're crossing the desert and you haven't got a bottle of water and there's no water any place in sight and someone comes along and says, I'll sell you 2 spoonfuls of water for $10, you'll pay for it. The same is true in California. California Governor Pat Brown interviewed in 1979. Even objects revolt against regimentation, Hans Richter. The energy in weather systems is greater than the energy in nuclear bombs. Paul Rogers, San Jose Mercury News.
Now remember, we live next door to the ocean, but we also live on the edge of a desert. Los Angeles is a desert community. Beneath this building, beneath our streets, is a desert. And without water, the dust will rise up and cover us as though we never existed.
Water envelops what exists before space was. Ivan Illich. The sky began to scare us with its light. Hamlin Garland. These pocked, scraped, pestled, granular, gradated, knuckled, angled, erupted, elbowed, bone-shard, concurrent, unriveted, uninvited, formationed rocks are already spoken for. These imperceptibly mobile, volcanically terse, porously impenetrable, socketed surfaces, which under other, slower circumstances were embedded interiors, have already been classified and are in the process of quiet vanishment, no glittering. The sun's shimmer stings and surveils, codename beautiful glimmer, bursts unnecessarily in contracted concrete formations, masses of obstinate movement. Necessity is the rhythmic assertions of liquid collision, the hums of erosion, the harmonic gleams of inevitability coating every surface like an unfiltered sheen, never evaporating. A surface atop the surface, skinned, stretched, smoothed, parceled, bought. Sorry for the long gap. Excerpting. History cannot be subtracted, only added, built up, buttressed, dammed. Our bodies the blockage causing debris to collect, our backs to the current, facing the suspended vortex of sedimented stoppage, time stuck in its tracks, floating belly up on the surface of having nothing new to say. To document the sinewy banks, language a circumstance, weapon. Our body, transparent horizon line, underneath what we do not see, do not remember, under the surface of what we see. Layers of skin, surface, tension, blanketing transparently over what once was a horizon, now a blurred sky made of nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, coarse particles, fine particles, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, fumes, mist, dust, dust, dust. Dusted lines over lines over lines, no pattern to the mapless cracks, forced up from the marrow of the untapped earth, forced language untapped to trim to timber, forced metrics to prove to prod, beneficent viability, forced numbers into sequence, into submission, forced the water into the pipeline, the people into the pipeline, into the people, into the water, into the people, into submission, thirsting. Thirst a surface atop the surface, oscillatory entanglements of borders and fissures, fault lines and parcels and modified genetics, orbital membrane around the city, our body a porous membrane, netting or threshing or bridging, surfacing into gaps where seepage or orders crystallize, atomize. Empty circulatory system, a nest made of fine print, only coherent as an afterthought. The dust rising, settling, rising, nestling too late into flooded crevices and folds. Breathless hollows where a we once were. We make the sun the moon, a man-made bulb incandesces quietly. Lit from behind, the earth tilts differently on its axis. Distant stars within our grasp on its axis. Voracious animal appetite, voracious capacity to structure, to sate, won't be sated. To be human, won't be sated. Tempted toward a gold-plated future, more human than human, voraciously robotic, in our displaced churning through lavish, insatiable thirst. Thank you.